Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this series on awareness through movement by Moshe Feldenkrais. And continuing, we have just read the chapter called Strata of Development. And I'm just going to do a little commentary for you on that chapter. I am, again, actually reading from the book. So this video is part of a playlist. If you want to go back to the beginning, you can hear me reading from the preface from the beginning of the book and doing commentaries along the way. All right, so let's jump into it. Okay, so what Feldenkrais is going to do in this chapter is he's going to talk about 3 different stages of learning that apply to really any activity. And these stages he calls the natural way, the individual stage, and the professional stage, or the stage of something becoming a method. And maybe you can hear just in those titles that not only are these 3 stages sort of like beginner, intermediate, advanced, but they also have to do with how the learning is being organized. And this ties into the discussion that he's already begun about the relationship between the individual and society, and of course, how this is central to how each one of us builds what he calls the self-image. Okay, so first of all, the natural stage. The natural stage is basically what every human being does. Most sort of elemental is in the beginning, learning to walk, learning to talk. He gives a number of examples of just very basic human activities, things that are found in every society around the world. And also there's no training manual for these things, right? This is the natural way. It's kind of like trial and error, and what we all seem to have done throughout evolution without any particular need for guidance. It's just what we do. There's a couple of quotations that I want to read from the discussion he has on this stage that I think are important. So he says, although these things come to us naturally, they are by no means simple. Even the simplest human activity is no less a mystery than the pigeon's return home over great distances or the bee's construction of a hive. So you may remember what I already mentioned in one of the previous commentaries, that later in this book, when we get to the 12 exercises, the awareness through movement lessons, Feldenkrais is going to have one that's all about standing up from a chair. And this would seem like a very basic activity, very just simple. And yet what he points out in the course of that awareness through movement lesson is that most of us actually have no idea how we get out of a chair. And when we start to examine it, that's what we discover. Like, wow, I don't actually know how this is done. Doesn't mean we can't do it, but we don't know how we're doing it. Okay, and then he also says the natural activities are a common heritage. And so that's that point I made before, that societies all around the globe, maybe not connected to each other, have discovered these things. But relevant to the Feldenkrais method, again, if you're working on improving something like standing up from a chair or like walking or rolling, these very basic activities, there's this elemental nature of these activities. It points to how improving these activities is going to have a kind of a general positive effect on the self-image, because they are activities that are so present in our life. Okay. So what's the second stage? The second stage is the individual stage. And he says certain persons found their own personal special way of carrying out the activities that came naturally. So you might think of this also in terms of evolution. We all have to learn to walk. We all have to learn how to talk. We all have to do different things. You can imagine hunter-gatherer society. Well, we have to figure out how to hunt down our dinner, right? But certain individuals, for whatever reason, they come up with something, and then others copy it, and you get the development of something new. So he gives the example of, for example, they learned to use a boomerang in Australia. The Swiss can yodel. The Japanese developed judo, and the South Sea Islanders know how to swim with a crawl stroke, right? And we know these things generalized around the world later, but that's getting to the next stage. Just to share a kind of a personal version of this, when I was in college, I took some classes with the composer and saxophone player Anthony Braxton, and he did a kind of a history of how jazz music had developed. And he would do these classes where he would look at a particular instrument and he would say, you know, in this time period, this was the person who was really creating something new, and then this person. So obvious example would be Charlie Parker, right? You already had a tradition of how the music was being played. Charlie Parker comes along, he does something completely new. Eventually this is called bebop. No one had thought of playing the saxophone the way he did, using the kind of rhythmic approach he did, and the way he chose the notes that he would put in his phrases. But once he did that, then all kinds of people were copying that. And then if we use this example to jump to the third stage, you can now go to schools of music and you can take a class on how to play bebop, because it becomes a method. It becomes someone at a certain point, in this case, maybe not Charlie Parker himself, but people studying what Charlie Parker did. They kind of systematize something and then they begin to teach it to broad number of people. So we see here that there's a sort of a historical trend in a particular activity tied to, you might say, human progress. Feldenkrais gives another example. He says women at a certain point were just helping each other to birth a baby, you know, helping each other in that moment. But then at a certain point, midwifery became a thing. And then eventually you had the midwife with the diploma. So what's especially important here, and we're going to start to see how this discussion of these three stages relates to the individual and how they build their self-image in relation to society, is that when these activities that first were natural and then through maybe an individual's discovery, they get something, there's something that's progressed and then they become systematized, the activity which originally was learned in a kind of a natural way, it's a different situation now because a method exists. So Feldenkrais says, society in general refuses to allow the individual the right to employ the natural method, forcing him instead to learn the accepted way before it will permit him to work. So maybe at this point, many people would be reluctant to just have a friend come and help at childbirth, even though that's used to be how it was. And, you know, many friends probably help their friends in that moment. But now we have this whole methodology, we have the healthcare system, right? So, and this is not to say necessarily it's good or bad, but if you just think about it from the point of view of learning, it might have been a normal thing that a woman would go to help her friend with a childbirth, and that's just not something that's so likely to happen at this point. Okay, so Feldenkrais goes into this a little further. He says, today, we can see the continued process of the development of consciously constructed systems in place of individual intuitive methods, and how actions that were once carried out naturally are becoming professions reserved for specialists. Then he makes another interesting point, which is that some of the first things to be systematized were more complex actions. So he talks about math, weaving carpets, philosophy. These fields had some kind of systematized method even thousands of years ago. But he says some of the basic activities like walking and standing are only now arriving at the third stage. Now, there are other methodologies out there at this point, obviously, to examine things like walking or standing up from a chair. But it's just worth noting that the Feldenkrais method is often looking at very basic everyday movements. And he's not actually talking about his method in this chapter, but if we ask what is the profession of a Feldenkrais practitioner all about, it's very much about examining our habits and our patterns in everyday experience, which Feldenkrais says is happening way, way later than something like, how do I weave a carpet? Okay, so let's talk about how this impacts the individual. Obviously, in this day and age, a child goes through schooling and then Typically, they may go to college or a trade school, but there's a sort of wide variety of options of what kind of thing they might do as an adult, right? So what is the experience of the individual in growing up and sort of sorting that out for themselves? So here's another quotation. In the course of his life, every person passes through all three stages in some of his activities. In many others, he passes through only one stage or through the first two. Every man is born into a definite period and grows into a society where he finds different activities in various stages of development, some in the first stage, some in the second, some in the third. So obviously, the moment in history when you're born is going to affect what you might develop for yourself, the kinds of things that you might end up doing as a career or a profession, or it also might affect what kind of hobbies you have. He's not talking here about professions versus hobbies, but he says, this is, I think, one of the key lines, that we do all three stages for many things. So think of what you are doing for profession. Think of what you have trained in. Well, you've maybe been through all three stages in that field, but in many other stages, we pass through only the first or the second stage. So there was the previous point he made about our potential, that we really don't live up to our potential. If we had clarified our self-image to an ideal degree, what we could do would be vastly more than what we all do now. But this sort of situation where there's this menu of activities in life that we might engage in, but there's these three stages, and we tend not to do those things that we can't sort of reach the professional level. We don't do them at all. Well, it begins to tie into this idea of like, we're not actually realizing all of our potential. Obviously, to do that, we have to actually engage in this variety of activities. My daughter, for example, right now is learning to ice skate. However, she did not begin when she was 2, 3 years old, like many of the Olympians did, right? So at a certain point, she looks around and she can see, other ice skaters, some of whom are younger than her, but have been started at a really young age. And then at a certain point, there's, if you want to, let's say, go to the Olympics, well, you need a coach and that costs money. And there's, so at a certain point, you really have to decide, well, do I enjoy this enough to continue doing this, even if I kind of can't reach the professional level? When I go with her, I don't take classes at all, but I've learned a little bit. I've learned, you might say, in the natural way. In any case, Feldenkrais says, every man adjusts himself to his time. But given this menu of options, there's also a question of your attitude. So he uses the example of singing here. Some people just say, hey, I can't sing, and I never learned how to sing. I can't do it, right? Other people never trained as singers, but they seem to naturally have a really beautiful voice and they enjoy singing. And some of those people, Feldenkrais says, they might even doubt that some trained singers can sing as well as they can. So here's just an example of how maybe different attitudes towards the potential for learning show up also in terms of how we develop our self-image. Okay, so again, if I want to develop my self-image to my potential, there is some obstacles in my way. And one, as we've discussed before, is our expectations of society, or the way that I understand the expectations of society. And here we see also that the historical period that I'm in, the way that humanity as a whole has developed up to this moment, affects me. Referring to the people who sort of explain, well, I can't sing because I never learned how, Feldenkrais says, they dare not even try to learn these arts by themselves because recognized methods exist. Okay, so the development of a particular profession, a particular methodology for learning an activity, we can see that it can be problematic in some ways for the individual. But of course, if that's the field that you want to study and you go into it, it has all kinds of value to offer you. He says, the systematic stage is of great importance. It enables us to find ways of behaving and acting that are in accordance with our personal and inner needs, ways that we might not discover naturally because circumstances and outside influences may have led us in other directions in which continued progress is impossible. And again, the Feldenkrais method is offering us to study things that are very much our everyday experience, but those are the places that we are deeply embedded in our habits. And what is the Feldenkrais method all about? It's about giving us this opportunity to notice, first of all, our habits, and then try non-habitual ways of doing that might create new possibilities. So the final sentence in the chapter, I think, is interesting if you frame it in terms of, you could look at your professional field and ask about your training. What was the quality of your training? Do you feel like when you graduated from whatever program led you into the work that you do now, that you were fully prepared to do that work? Feldenkrais says, systematic study and awareness should provide man with a means of scanning all fields of action so he can find a place for himself where he can act and breathe freely. So how do we get to the point of not only really understanding the activity that we're engaged in and developing the highest level of competency, but also knowing which activity is best for us, and then finding what we need in order to gain those skills? It's not a straight path, and I think that's the main piece that he's clarifying for us in this chapter. But then again, whether or not we successfully or skillfully navigated the educational institutions that were available to us in our life, in either case, this is very much another piece of our self-image. And again, there may be things even in our professional training that at a certain point we're going to want to reconsider, because this is, as he says, there's the natural way, there's the individual way, and then there's the method. But even the method can evolve over time. The Feldenkrais method, just to give an example, Feldenkrais died back in 1984, but practitioners of his method continue to teach. And not only do they teach the awareness through movement lessons that Feldenkrais created many years ago, but also we develop our own awareness through movement lessons. And so you can see how there's a potential evolution there. Okay, so that's my commentary on the strata of development. And next time we'll get into the chapter that's called Where to Begin and How.